Sorry, would you mind taking the next one? It'll be here in a few seconds.
Is there a reason I can't ride this one?
I just prefer the space to myself. It's been a long morning.
Right, but this is a public elevator.
I know. I'm asking for a little consideration.
Is the consideration because I'm black?
Andrew Taylor woke up at 5:15 in the morning, as he had done every day for more than 20 years. This was his sacred hour, the time when the world was still quiet and he could think without interruptions. He brewed strong coffee in the kitchen of his penthouse apartment, that same apartment at the top of the 50-story building he had bought 15 years ago when it was just a distant dream. Now, that entire building had his name on the deed, Taylor Tower. Every square inch, every elevator, every conference room, everything belonged to him. But Andrew was never the type who needed to announce his importance. He preferred to observe, listen, understand how things really worked at ground level. On that specific Tuesday, Andrew had a crucial meeting scheduled for 9 in the morning. It was a quarterly review with mid-level executives, people who managed entire departments, but rarely interacted directly with him. Andrew liked these meetings because they showed the true health of the company, away from the polished reports that senior executives presented. He knew he would meet new people, evaluate talent, perhaps identify future leaders, or perhaps identify problems that needed to be resolved. He finished his coffee, put on dark jeans and a casual button-down shirt, nothing that screamed wealth or power. Andrew never felt the need to wear expensive suits when he wasn't in formal meetings with investors. At 8:45, Andrew left his apartment and walked down the private hallway to the executive elevator. But when he pressed the button, nothing happened. He pressed again. Still nothing. The private elevator was out of service, something he would discover later was an emergency maintenance that his team had forgotten to notify him about. It wasn't a serious problem. Andrew simply walked to the main hallway and pressed the button for the regular elevator, the one that all other employees and building tenants used. He checked his watch. He still had 15 minutes before the meeting, enough time to go down 48 floors to the 22nd, where the main conference room was located. The elevator arrived empty. Andrew entered and pressed the button for the 22nd floor. The doors were beginning to close when he heard hurried footsteps and a female voice yelling to hold it. Andrew quickly placed his hand between the doors, making them open again. A white woman in her 40s appeared running down the hallway, holding an expensive leather briefcase and a premium brand coffee in the other hand. She was wearing an impeccable gray suit, high heels that made noise on the marble floor, and had that expression of someone who was late and irritated with the world because of it. Andrew took a step to the side, making room for her to enter. The woman stopped abruptly at the elevator entrance. Her eyes scanned Andrew from head to toe in a fraction of a second. He saw the change in her expression, that quick calculation some people make when they see someone who doesn't fit their expectations. Andrew knew that look. He had seen that look more times than he could count throughout his life. In expensive stores where security guards followed him through the aisles. In fine restaurants where hosts assumed he was in the wrong place. In business meetings where people presumed he was someone's assistant, not the company owner. That look said everything without needing words. The woman didn't enter the elevator. Instead, she took a small step back and said in a voice that tried to sound polite but overflowed with discomfort that she would wait for the next one. Andrew stood there, holding the door, processing what had just happened. He said nothing immediately, just looked at her with that calm that came from years of dealing with ignorance disguised as personal preference. The elevator was completely empty. There was enough space for 10 people, but she didn't want to share that space with him. And they both knew exactly why, even though she would never admit it out loud. Andrew released the elevator door and let it close. He wasn't going to force anyone to share space with him if that person clearly didn't want to. He had learned long ago that you can't force people to see your humanity when they have already decided you don't deserve basic respect. He stood there alone inside as the elevator descended, thinking about how many times this had happened throughout his life. How many times he had been judged by the color of his skin before even opening his mouth. The difference now was that he had power, resources, and the ability to do something about it when necessary. The elevator stopped on the 35th floor. The doors opened, and the same woman was there, waiting. She had clearly taken the next elevator and descended faster because that one had stopped at fewer floors. When she saw Andrew still inside the elevator, her expression changed from neutral to visibly irritated. She hesitated again at the door, looking inside as if weighing her options. There were 3 other people in the elevator now, all white, all professionally dressed. Their presence apparently made the space safe enough for her. She entered and positioned herself as far away from Andrew as possible, practically squeezing herself into the opposite corner. Andrew observed all of this with an almost anthropological interest. He saw how she held her purse closer to her body, how she avoided any eye contact with him specifically, though she chatted politely with a man in a suit next to her about the weather, how she checked her phone constantly, using it as a social shield. Each small gesture of hers communicated discomfort and prejudice, wrapped in a thin layer of plausible deniability. If anyone confronted her, she would say it was just personal preference, that she was having a bad day, that it had nothing to do with race. But Andrew knew better. He had lived this too many times not to recognize the patterns. The elevator made 2 more stops before reaching the 22nd floor. When the doors opened, Andrew exited first and walked down the hallway toward the main conference room. He could hear the woman's footsteps behind him, also going in the same direction. This was interesting. She clearly worked on that floor or had a meeting there. Andrew wondered vaguely which department she worked in, but soon forgot the thought. He had more important things to worry about than the prejudices of a mid-level executive he would probably never see again after that morning. The conference room was impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of Los Angeles. There were already several people seated around the long mahogany table when Andrew entered. He recognized some faces from reports and photos he had reviewed, but many were new to him. His executive assistant, James, was standing near the head of the table organizing papers. When James saw Andrew, his face lit up with relief. He had been worried about where Andrew was since. It was unusual for him not to arrive 15 minutes early for any meeting. Andrew waved to James, indicating everything was fine, and casually walked to the coffee table in the corner of the room. He served himself water, grabbed some fruit from the tray, and observed people arriving. Most paid no attention to him, assuming he was someone's assistant, or perhaps someone from the tech team setting up equipment. Some looked curiously, probably wondering who this black man in jeans was at an executive meeting. Andrew was used to being underestimated. In fact, he often used it to his advantage. People said things near him they would never say if they knew who he really was. And then, exactly at 8:59, she entered the room. The woman from the elevator. She carried her briefcase and coffee, chatting animatedly with another executive. When her eyes swept the room and landed on Andrew near the coffee table, she frowned slightly, clearly wondering why that man from the elevator was there. But she quickly looked away and went to find her seat at the table. Andrew saw the small name card in front of one of the chairs. Ellen Morrison, Director of Human Resources. Interesting. The HR director was the person who had refused to share an elevator with him. At 9 o'clock sharp, James tapped lightly on the table to get everyone's attention. The room fell silent, with 12 executives seated around the table, all looking expectantly at the head where presumably the company owner would sit. James smiled and began the introduction he had made hundreds of times before. He thanked everyone for attending, mentioned the importance of the quarterly meeting, and then said the words that would make Ellen Morrison's blood run cold. He introduced Andrew Taylor, founder and owner of Taylor Tower, and invited him to come to the head of the table. Andrew placed his water glass on the coffee table and walked calmly toward the main chair. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. All eyes were on him now, but none wider than Ellen's. She had turned white as a sheet. Her hand, which was holding a pen, began to tremble visibly. Andrew saw the exact moment when the full realization hit her. The man she had refused to share the elevator with, the man she had looked down on with barely disguised contempt, was the owner of everything. The building. The company. Her job. Andrew sat at the head of the table and opened the folder James had prepared for him. He let the silence stretch for a few more seconds, savoring it in a way he knew was a bit petty, but that felt satisfying nonetheless. Then, with that calm, professional voice he used in high-level negotiations, he began the meeting. He thanked everyone for their dedication, talked about the quarter's objectives, and mentioned he was particularly interested in hearing about company culture, and how departments were managing human resources. When he said the words, human resources, his eyes briefly landed on Ellen. She was practically sinking into her chair. The meeting proceeded with each executive presenting reports from their departments. Andrew asked pointed questions, praised good initiatives, and suggested improvements where he saw necessary. He was professional, fair, and completely focused on numbers and strategies. No one in the room would have guessed what had happened in the elevator just 30 minutes before. But when it was Ellen's turn to present the human resources report, the tension in the room visibly shifted. She stood up with trembling legs, grabbed her remote for the presentation, and tried to begin. Her voice came out weak and unstable. Ellen tried to focus on the slides, talking about employee retention rates, new training programs, and diversity initiatives. The irony of that last part was not lost on Andrew. She was standing there presenting diversity and inclusion programs while she had literally refused to share an elevator with the only black man present half an hour earlier. Andrew let her finish the entire presentation without interruption. When she finally sat down, clearly relieved it was over, Andrew leaned forward and asked a simple question. He asked how she personally implemented diversity and inclusion values on a day-to-day basis, not just in formal programs, but in everyday interactions. Ellen opened and closed her mouth several times, searching for words that wouldn't come. She knew that he knew. Everyone in the room could feel there was something more happening in this exchange, though they didn't understand exactly what. Andrew waited patiently for the answer, his face neutral, but his eyes penetrating. Ellen finally mumbled something about leading by example and treating everyone with respect. Andrew nodded slowly, and then said something that made several executives in the room stiffen. He said it was interesting she mentioned respect, because he had noticed certain behaviors that very morning that suggested a disconnect between written policies and actual actions. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Ellen knew exactly what he was talking about. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, but Ellen could barely concentrate on anything else. She sat there, feeling the weight of Andrew's occasional glance, knowing her career was hanging by a thread. When the meeting finally ended, the other executives stood up, chatting among themselves as they left. Ellen gathered her papers with trembling hands, trying to leave quickly before Andrew could say anything. But when she was almost at the door, she heard his voice calling her name. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it was simply a clear, calm instruction. Ellen Morrison, please stay a few more minutes. The last executives left, casting curious glances back. James also prepared to leave, but Andrew asked him to stay. Ellen stood near the door, her briefcase pressed against her chest like a shield. Andrew remained seated at the head of the table, his hands folded calmly in front of him. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Ellen finally gathered courage to speak first, her voice coming out desperate and rushed. She began to stammer an apology about the elevator, saying it had been a misunderstanding, that she hadn't been feeling well that morning, that she was late and stressed. Andrew let her talk, watching as she tangled herself more and more in her own justifications. When she finally stopped to breathe, he spoke. His voice was soft, but there was steel underneath it. He said he wasn't interested in rehearsed excuses or stories they both knew were lies. He had seen her hesitation, the calculation in her eyes, the way she had literally recoiled when she saw him alone in the elevator. He described each detail with clinical precision, how she had positioned herself as far away from him as possible when she finally entered, how she held her purse closer, how she avoided eye contact. Ellen tried to interrupt him, but he gently raised his hand, asking her to let him finish. Andrew continued, saying he was 47 years old and had seen this behavior all his life. In restaurants, in stores, in elevators, on planes. People who looked at him and saw a threat instead of a human being. People who made small choices every day that communicated he was less worthy of space, of courtesy, of basic humanity. He said what made this particularly problematic was the fact that Ellen was the director of human resources, responsible for creating and implementing diversity and inclusion policies. How could she genuinely advocate for these values when her own actions showed exactly the kind of prejudice these programs were meant to combat? Ellen was crying now, tears running down her carefully made-up face. She tried to talk about how she wasn't racist, how she had black friends, how she supported social justice causes. Andrew shook his head slowly. He said those words meant nothing when her actions completely contradicted them. Racism wasn't just burning crosses or using slurs. It was this too. It was the 1,000 small ways people made others feel invisible, unwanted, dangerous, simply for existing. It was refusing to share an empty elevator because someone's skin color made you uncomfortable. It was presuming that a black man in jeans couldn't possibly be the owner of a 50-story building. James, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. He gently asked Andrew what he wanted to do about the situation. Andrew was silent for a long moment, watching Ellen disintegrate in front of him. Part of him wanted to fire her on the spot, send her away as a clear example that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. But another part of him, the part that had built an empire through careful and strategic decisions, knew there was an opportunity here. An opportunity to create real change instead of just symbolic punishment. He finally spoke, and what he said surprised both Ellen and James. He said that Ellen had a choice ahead of her. Andrew explained the choice clearly and directly. Ellen could resign immediately, walk out the door with some dignity and tact, and look for employment elsewhere. He would give her a resignation letter without cause, without mentioning the specific incident, and she could try to rebuild her career away from there. It was the easier option for both of them, clean and quick. Or, he continued, she could stay and spend the next 6 months proving she was capable of real change. But this wouldn't be comfortable. She would be transferred to a temporary position as a diversity consultant, working directly with communities she clearly didn't understand. She would attend intensive training, not those superficial 40-minute videos the company used to use, but real and painful workshops that would force her to confront her own prejudices. Ellen wiped away tears and asked in a trembling voice what would happen after 6 months. Andrew said it would depend entirely on her. If she showed genuine growth, if she really did the necessary internal work, she could return to the position of HR director or perhaps take on an even more important position in implementing real cultural changes in the company. But if she just went through the process without really changing, without truly understanding why her actions that morning were so problematic, then she would be fired, and everyone would know exactly why. Andrew wasn't going to protect her from consequences if she didn't take this seriously. He gave her 24 hours to decide. Ellen left the conference room looking like she had aged 10 years. Her colleagues who were still in the hallway saw her leave with a tear-stained face and quickly looked away, embarrassed. No one asked what had happened. The tension in the meeting had been too obvious. Ellen went straight to the women's restroom, locked herself in a stall, and cried until she had no more tears. She knew she'd been caught, knew that her automatic excuses about stress and misunderstandings hadn't fooled anyone. Andrew had seen through her with a clarity that was both humiliating and terrifying. That night, Ellen could barely sleep. She lay next to her husband, who snored peacefully, replaying the day over and over in her mind. Every detail of the elevator encounter now seemed magnified, impossible to ignore. She had really recoiled when she saw Andrew alone there, had really waited for another elevator because his presence made her uncomfortable. She tried to convince herself it wasn't about race, that it was just safety instinct, that any woman would do the same. But the excuses sounded hollow even in her own head. There were 3 other men in the second elevator, and she entered without hesitation. The difference was obvious, and she could no longer pretend she didn't see it. Ellen thought about accepting the resignation, starting over somewhere else where no one knew this story. It would be easier. But then she thought about having to explain to her husband why she lost a job that paid over $150,000 a year. Thought about the difficulty of getting another position at the same level without decent references. And, more deeply, thought about what it would mean to run away from this. She was 43 years old. If she didn't confront her prejudices now, when would she? Andrew was offering her something few people received, a real second chance accompanied by true accountability. The next day, Ellen entered Andrew's office at 9 a.m. sharp. James made her wait for 15 minutes, which she deserved to use to calm her nerves. When she was finally called in, she found Andrew sitting behind his enormous desk, looking out the window at the city below. He turned when she entered and gestured for her to sit. Ellen remained standing, her hands clasped nervously in front of her body. With a firm voice that surprised even herself, Ellen said she chose to stay, that she chose to do the difficult work, that she wanted to really change, not just to save her job, but because she had seen something in herself that morning in the elevator that deeply shamed her. Andrew studied her face for a long moment, looking for signs of sincerity. Finally, he nodded and said the work would begin on Monday. The following 6 months were the most difficult of Ellen's professional life. Andrew wasn't joking when he said it would be uncomfortable. In the first week, she was sent to a 3-day workshop on implicit bias, facilitated by a psychologist specializing in racial bias. Ellen had to watch videos of herself in simulated situations, seeing her own micro-behaviors when interacting with people of different races. It was brutal to see herself clutch her purse when a black man approached in an exercise, or how her body language changed depending on the skin color of the person she was talking to. Things she had never consciously noticed were exposed under bright and merciless lights. Ellen was also assigned to work directly with community organizations in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. She spent weeks helping with employment programs, listening to stories of people who had been repeatedly passed over for promotions, followed in stores, or treated with suspicion in their own neighborhoods. A woman named Teresa told Ellen about being stopped by police 17 times in 2 years simply for driving a nice car while being black. A young man named Marcus, not much older than Ellen's son, described being followed by security every time he entered department stores. These stories weren't abstract statistics. They were real people with real pain caused by prejudices that Ellen had contributed to perpetuating without even realizing it. The turning point came in the 4th month. Ellen was facilitating a discussion group about workplace experiences when a participant named Nicole shared a story about a white colleague who always clutched her purse when Nicole entered the elevator. Ellen felt like she had been punched in the stomach. She saw herself in that story, saw Andrew in that empty elevator, and for the first time truly understood the depth of what she had done. It wasn't just an uncomfortable moment she caused. It was another brick in the wall of experiences that told Andrew, and millions like him, they were seen as threats before being seen as human. Ellen began to cry in the middle of the session, which was completely unprofessional, but also completely genuine. She apologized to the group for breaking composure, but Nicole gently said that tears were part of the process of unlearning decades of conditioning. That discomfort was necessary for real growth. After the session, Ellen stayed and talked with Nicole for 2 hours, sharing for the first time the complete story of what happened with Andrew. Nicole listened without judgment and then said something Ellen would never forget. She said Ellen was doing the work that most white people refuse to do, that recognizing the problem was just the first step, but making real internal change was where most people gave up. At the end of 6 months, Ellen presented a comprehensive report to Andrew about what she had learned and how she planned to implement real changes in the human resources department. It wasn't just new policies on paper. It was a complete overhaul of how the company recruited, trained, and promoted employees. Ellen proposed partnerships with historically Black universities, specific mentorship programs for employees of color, and most importantly, mandatory implicit bias training for all executives facilitated by external professionals, not just generic corporate videos. She also suggested creating a diversity council with real decision-making power, not just an advisory function. Andrew read the report carefully, asking pointed questions about implementation and success metrics. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied Ellen for a long moment. She looked different now. Lighter somehow, as if she had dropped a weight she carried without realizing. He asked her directly if she still felt uncomfortable sharing elevators with Black men. Ellen met his eyes and said honestly that she still had to consciously fight conditioned reactions sometimes, but that she now recognized those thoughts for what they were and actively challenged them. That the work would never be completely finished, but that she was committed to the ongoing process of unlearning prejudices and relearning humanity. Andrew accepted. Ellen returned to the position of HR director, but now with a very different mission. In the following 2 years, Taylor Tower became known as one of the most progressive employers in the region on diversity and inclusion issues. The retention rate of minority employees increased dramatically. Stories of discrimination dropped to almost zero. And it all started because a black man in jeans was judged in an elevator and chose not just to punish, but to educate. Ellen never forgot that morning. She kept a small note on her desk that simply said, "Remember the elevator." It was a constant reminder that prejudice wasn't always intentional, but always harmful, and that the choice to do better was available in every moment of every day. Andrew occasionally still took the regular elevator instead of the executive one. He liked to observe the interactions, see how the culture had changed, and sometimes, just sometimes, he saw Ellen there too, deliberately choosing to share space with people she would have avoided before, doing the difficult work of living the values she now taught others.